We're going to transition to our feature presentation from Maya Dukmasova. She's a senior reporter at Injustice Watch, so we're going to let her take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for the intro. I am Maya Dukmasova, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys a little bit about how we can go about investigating judges and the courts. I'll share my experience doing this type of work as a journalist, and kind of some practices we've developed at Injustice Watch to investigate people running for judge and people who are already judges when we put together our judicial election guides, which I hope everyone who's watching and everyone those people know, all are using this guide when they vote for judges in Cook County every 2 years. So I will start sharing my screen, and hopefully this works smoothly. Okay. So if something ends up being off during the presentation, please one of the organizers just ping me in the Zoom chat. All right, so before I get into the details and into the nitty-gritty of like the process we use at Injustice Watch to try to get behind the veil of the judiciary, first I thought it would be useful to just kind of give an overview of what the courts are and the basic structure of the judicial branch of government. So as a kind of basic reminder, our government at the federal and state and local level, it's divided into 3 branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. And as one of the reasons why it's difficult to do reporting on the courts in Illinois is because the Illinois FOIA law does not apply to the judicial branch of government, even to programs and administrative business and things related to money that are conducted through the court system. In some states, there are much more broad FOIA laws where this kind of information can access. But as you'll see as I go through my presentation, a lot of things fall under the jurisdiction of the courts that are not just judges making decisions in a courtroom. So, but first, just as a basic kind of reminder, there are 2 levels of the court system in the United States. There's federal courts and there's state courts. And everything we're going to talk about today has to do with state courts in Illinois, but just to kind of get you oriented, federal courts are the judges in federal courts are nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate. There's 3 levels to the federal court systems. There's district courts, and every state has usually several district courts. So you see in this picture on the left, these are the districts. This is how the 3 federal court districts are divided in Illinois. We have the Northern District. The courthouse for the Northern District is, where Ed Burke is, getting prosecuted for racketeering. It's the building downtown on Dearborn. And then we have the Central District of Illinois and the Southern District. The appellate court level of the federal courts, they're divided into, they're called circuits. So you see on the map on the right, Illinois is part of the 7th Circuit. So appeals coming up from the district court, from the district courts in Illinois would end up in the 7th Circuit, which also hears appeals from Wisconsin and Indiana. So the whole country is divided into these appellate circuits. And then finally, at the top of that is the United States Supreme Court. So the judges that serve on the federal judiciary at every level, they have lifetime tenure. Once they're appointed, that's their gig for life. And this presentation, we're not really getting into talking about how to investigate federal judges. This has not been really part of Injustice Watch's purview. I personally don't have experience with that. I could talk very, very big picture about it if anybody has questions at the end about that, but just so we're all oriented, everything I'm saying today does not apply to the federal courts and federal judges. All right, so at the state level, again, there are 3 levels of state courts. There's county level or trial courts. Every single state has trial courts that are usually just focused on one county, or sometimes it can be multiple counties, depending on how population and other things work in the state. Then there's an appellate court system in every state, and then every state has a state Supreme Court. And every single state in the United States has kind of a different system for filling their courts with judges. And their states can also have different systems for getting judges on the bench at the trial court level, at the county level, and, then getting this, filling their Supreme Courts. Just as a brief overview, we mostly at Injustice Watch, we focus on the trial court judges. These are the judges, the Cook County judges, who are tasked with overseeing cases involving state law, Illinois state law. They are the judges that we all encounter, are most likely to encounter going about our day-to-day lives. These are the judges that make decisions that directly impact our lives. I'll show you guys a little chart to really make this clear later, but judges are responsible for a lot of things that happen in people's lives that are beyond just like criminal matters. At the county level, for filling the judgeships at the county level, so we have like 20 states in the country that have nonpartisan elections for those judges. We have 9 states where the governor appoints the county level judges, another 9 states where there are partisan elections, that includes Illinois. 7 states have governors appointing based on suggestions from nominating committees. Then we have 4 states that have a kind of a combination of methods. This actually also includes Illinois. And 2 states have judges appointed by state legislatures, which is kind of interesting. So the Illinois system of partisan judicial elections is not the norm in most of the country. All right, so the state court system in Illinois, again, has a Supreme Court and an appellate court, and the justices on the Supreme Court and the appellate court whom we elect. So we don't have a different system for electing Supreme and appellate court judges and circuit court county judges. All the judges from the county court all the way up to the Supreme Court in Illinois are elected in partisan elections. And it's just the terms that the judges serve that are different. So the Supreme Court and appellate court justices serve 10-year terms. And once they're at the end of their first 10-year term, they run for retention. So that means that voters have to decide yes or no whether to keep them on the bench for another 10 years. Judges in Illinois are never subject to the kind of elections that like every other type of elected official is, where like somebody runs against them. They're only ever essentially running against their own record. That's what a retention election is. And judges have to get 60% yes votes in order to stay on the bench, which is kind of an astronomical number if you think about it for democracy. But it's extremely rare that judges lose these elections, and I'll get to more of that a little bit later. But so Supreme Court and appellate court justices, 10-year terms, and then they're up for retention every 10 years. Trial courts, that's the county level. In Illinois, the trial courts are made up of a mixture of circuit judges and associate judges. So in Cook County, for example, we have about 400 judges, and 2/3 of them are circuit judges whom we, the public, elect. And 1/3 of them are associate judges who are not elected by the public. And I'll explain that in a second. So the circuit judges they serve 6-year terms. And just like the appellate and Supreme Court justices, people run when a seat on the bench opens up because like a judge retires or dies, or I don't know, gets elected to another position, or has to resign or whatever, that seat opens up and there's a primary process. There's a primary election. There's a partisan election to get that seat filled. So candidates typically who aren't already judges, but they have to be lawyers at least and reside in Illinois and blah, blah, blah. They run for, to get on the bench for the first time. And in Cook County, this tends to be just like a Democratic Party show, like all elected politics in Cook County. So typically the Cook County Democratic primary is really the place where new candidates are decided, like, because by the time you get to November, there's rarely the Republican challengers. So whoever won the Democratic primary usually ends up, by default winning the November election. And after their first 6-year term, these judges are also going to be up for retention. That's that yes or no vote on the November ballot. There's no running against judges that are already seated. So associate judges they serve 4-year terms, and the process to become an associate judge is, so associate judges, to become an associate judge, an attorney basically who's interested, they apply they fill out some forms and a bunch of application materials with the Illinois Supreme Court. They submit their applications, and then their applications go through like a vetting and review process by a different kind of set of committees, like one that's part of the Supreme Court. There's also a committee at the circuit court level at which that person is applying to be a judge. So in Cook County, the chief judge of the Cook County Circuit Court has a committee made up of all of the presiding judges of the different court divisions. And those people like go through the applications and sort of vet them and decide who they want to be on the finalist. And after all these committees on the finalist list, after all these committees, go through these applications, a short list is produced that has twice as many candidates as there are open positions. So usually the associate judge openings, they like put them up in batches. So most, like if there's like, after like a certain number of them accumulates empty seats on the bench, there'll be this call for applications saying like new associate judge openings. And these committees will do their work and produce a short list that has to have twice as many candidates as there are openings. So if there are 10 openings, there are going to be 20 finalists on the short list. And then it's the circuit judges that we elect that get to vote on who becomes an associate judge. So they get to vote only on the people from that short list. And once the associate judges are elected in that manner, they have 4-year terms, and again, at the end of the 4 years, they're up for retention, and they're usually blanket retained by the circuit judges every 4 years. Like it's very it's very rare that an associate judge loses a retention election. One other thing I'll note is that when a circuit judge is like, let's say somebody dies without, in the middle of their term and a vacancy is created, the Illinois Supreme Court is the only state in the country where Illinois is the only state in the country where the Supreme Court is the entity that makes the appointment to fill the vacant judicial seat. And this is very important because the Supreme Court has a lot of power to decide who fills circuit judgeship on an interim basis. And the people who are temporarily appointed to fill judgeships have a huge leg up when they actually are running for that position in the primary. This is just a little graphic from related to this past election that we had. So these basically everybody who was elected as circuit judge for the first time this past primary election in March was already a judge because they had been temporarily appointed by the Supreme Court. And in the graphic, you can see these these are the three Supreme Court justices from Cook County. So just to go back real quick. So this map is color coded by the districts of the Illinois Supreme Court. So we have Cook County, which is its own district that has 3 Supreme Court justices. And then we have the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th districts, and each one of them has 1 Supreme Court justice. So our 7-member Supreme Court is made up of 3 people from Cook County and 4 people from the rest of the state. So the 3 Cook County justices currently are Justice Joy Cunningham, Chief Justice Marion Jane Tice, and Justice P. Scott Neville. And these people you see below them are all people that they appointed temporarily to fill vacant judgeships that all subsequently were elected in March. Very few of them even were running in contested elections. And I did a whole story about why this election was so uncompetitive. But the way that people get appointed through this Supreme Court appointment process is, it will come as no surprise to anyone, is incredibly political. And each of the 3 justices kind of take turns having an opportunity to appoint someone to a vacancy. And yeah, the story I wrote gets all into kind of how these appointments happen. And it's yeah, there's not a lot of nobody sent who get appointed to these vacancies. All right, so in Cook County, another thing to keep in mind in terms of elected judges, judges are either elected in county-wide races, meaning that everybody in the county gets to vote on the candidate, or they're elected from one of 20 subcircuits. So as of this election year, the county has now been divvied up into 20 subcircuits. Before it used to be 15, now it's 20. And here you can see a map of the subcircuits. And the point of the subcircuits, they were created in the early 90s to essentially increase non-white Irish Democratic male representation on the bench. So it was a bunch of Black, Latino, and Republican interest groups that got together and like created the subcircuit system so that there were smaller electoral districts that could elect judges from within their community to diversify the Cook County bench. And by and large, that process has yielded a more diverse judiciary. So when judges are elected in a subcircuit, there's kind of a lower bar for running, in the sense that like you don't have to collect as many nominating petition signatures to get on the ballot. It's not as expensive to run in those races. The Cook County Democratic Party doesn't endorse candidates in the subcircuit, so sometimes it can be a little bit less of a heavy lift in that sense, because you're not running against like a giant party apparatus. Although, I mean, if it's like a party person that's running, they're going to have a lot of help, even if it's not the official party endorsement. But once the judges are elected, whether they were elected countywide or in a subcircuit, that has no relationship or bearing whatsoever on where in the courts they're assigned or what they end up doing. Regardless of how they were elected, countywide or subcircuit, when they are up for retention in 6 years, that's a countywide vote, and the whole county gets to vote on whether or not to keep them on the bench. So again, you have to get 60% yes votes to win up. And it's not like 60% of the people who drew a ballot. It's 60% of the people who bothered to vote on that retention question. So like if, I don't know, 1 million people drew a ballot and only 500,000 voted for John Smith to stay on, whether or not to keep John Smith on the bench, like he has to get 60% of that 500 people to keep his job. So skipping the retention judges on your ballot is not a way to like decrease anyone's chances of getting retained. And historically, like basically almost no one ever loses these retention races unless they're involved in a really big scandal. And I'm talking about like these kinds of scandals. So we have in 2018, there was a historic push there was a huge organizing effort to get this judge, Matthew Coughlin, off the bench. This guy, there was a slew of different groups working to get him not retained, to make him lose the retention election. Ultimately, the Cook County Democratic Party turned against him. Tony Preckwinkle was making robocalls, the day before election day, saying like, vote no on Judge Coughlin. He was involved in some of the cases involving confessions extracted by disgraced Chicago police detective Guevara, and his involvement in these cases came to light during that election cycle. Some of the people who were wrongfully convicted were like, they were participating in an effort to kind of raise grassroots awareness about this guy. And so ultimately he was not retained. Another one that wasn't retained in 2020 was a judge who caught a bunch of negative press for locking up her grandniece in a holding cell as like a kind of timeout. That really didn't, that story landed like in a very close to election time. She also had a very problematic track record in her decision making as a judge, but I think it was the scandal that had more of an impact. And then, this story down here about the massage parlor, this was an associate judge actually who, I wrote this story about this guy, and he like took medical leave and filed his paperwork to retire the day after I called him to ask him about this massage parlor situation. But then he had planned to retire like a few days after the retention election for associate judges, because if he had been retained, he would have gotten like a bump in his pension. However, he was not retained, so they did not vote to keep him, and he did not get the bump in his pension. Anyway, so the other thing I want to mention is that the courts are, so this is why investigating the judiciary and the court system is important, because the courts are not just criminal courts. This is a flowchart of everything that the Cook County Office of the Chief Judge oversees. So as you can see here, the criminal courts, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor. Hopefully you can, but the criminal division, so that it is like one little part of the county department of the court system. So you have things like traffic tickets, marriages and divorces, probate stuff, which is related to when people pass away and they're like estates and wills, lawsuits of all sorts. The vast majority of like the hundreds of thousands of cases that are processed through the Cook County court system every year are not criminal cases, even when you count within that like misdemeanor cases, of which there are way more than there are felony cases. But judicial accountability, kind of like public attention on judicial accountability, tends to disproportionately focus on criminal court judges. And I mean, for good reason, because these are people making decisions that are really kind of huge life or death, basically, decisions in a lot of people's lives. But a lot of other types of judges make huge decisions related to people's livelihoods. So just important to keep that in mind. And then there's a whole aspect of that you see up here on the kind of top left quadrant, the non-judicial offices that are overseen by the Office of the Chief Judge. And like, for example, the probation department. We cannot FOIA anything about the probation department in Cook County because it's overseen by the Office of the Chief Judge. We cannot know anything about the Juvenile Detention Center through FOIA because that is overseen by the Chief Judge. We, same thing with Public Guardian's Office. Guardianship is not just pertaining to minor children, but also to elderly and mentally disabled people. So we cannot find out what's going on in that corner of this court bureaucracy because it's not subject to FOIA. There's a social service department, all kinds of stuff is out of reach of public records requests because it's all part of this judicial branch of government. So this is just a quick summary on how, in the context of this lack of easy access to information, how Injustice Watch goes about investigating candidates for judge and sitting judges as we prepare our judicial election guides. So for the primary candidates, most of them are going to be people, lawyers, although some of them, like this cycle, we had a lot of people who were already judges because they had been temporarily appointed by the Supreme Court. But what we'll do is we research people's employment history. Obviously, we get their resumes, we find out where they worked. Anytime they had previously worked for government agencies, we FOIA those agencies for their employment records. We look at property records, we find out what they own, where, you know, even if it's in other states, we look at ethics disclosures. So this one is kind of neat. Judges are actually, and I'll see if I can close out of this for a sec so I can show you. So there are kind of three places where ethics disclosures live. There's the Secretary of State has ethics disclosures that are required to be filed by almost every type of state employee. So you can literally go into, like, you know, pick your year, put in a candidate's, put in a person's name or last name and submit it, and you're going to get. So for example, I wanted to see Dej Desai. She's a judge now. Here's her ethics disclosure for 2024 as part of the Administrative Office of Illinois Courts. So even though the judges are elected to be county judges, the state pays their salaries. So they are in this state database, and they have to do these ethics disclosures as state employees. There's also ethics disclosure requirements for certain type of Cook County employees, and this is the Cook County Ethics Statement of Economic Interest website. Very cumbersome to navigate. Also, not a whole ton of different kinds of people end up filing disclosures with this. It's like not that many types of employees that have to. So I don't find it to be helpful very often. And then the some Chicago employees also have to file ethics statements, and so we find them on the Chicago website. Again, not usually terribly helpful, but the ethics disclosures from the that are for sure that we always find are the state, you know, people who used to be employed by the state or by another unit of government, and candidates when they run for office in Illinois also have to file an ethics statement with the Illinois Secretary of State. So I'll just quickly show you an example of, this was a candidate, again, who just got elected judge in the primary. So let's see if I can actually bring this in here, if it'll show up. Can you guys see this PDF I'm putting up here? Someone tell me in the chat if this is visible. Yes, okay, great. So Dej Desai, who previously, was just elected judge in this past primary, she had previously worked for the Illinois Comptroller's Office. So she was the general counsel there. So this is the ethics statement that I pulled for her from the Secretary of State's office. And as you can see, it's not terribly informative, but it says that she has investment in real estate, 2 properties in Chicago. So that, okay, now I know when I'm researching property records, I'm potentially looking for 2 places that she and or her husband own. Multiple investment accounts, okay. And a lot of these will just look like this, that like, oh, you know, it's just like none. A lot of questions, they just get answered none. It's asking about other government employees in her family. Oh, it says spouse employment, city of Chicago. Okay, not terribly helpful. Her husband works for the city. All right, so then I look at her economic disclosures for the that she has to file as a candidate. So here, again, nothing terribly helpful on the first page. Here, though, she says that she has an additional, so on the first one, she had this information about having an additional appointment with Cook County as a contractual employee. Here it says she's a Cook County Special Prosecutor Services. She's an independent contractor. So now I've learned a little bit more. Now it's asking about her employment with the state and any family members, and oh, City of Chicago police officer. So that's what her spouse does for the City of Chicago. So now I'm trying to find out, okay, who's the cop she's married to. That all becomes easier once I have some basic coordinates. Okay, it's like her spouse is employed with the Chicago Police Department. Once people become judges, and this is true whether they're temporarily appointed, or they become associate judges, or they become circuit judges through elections, they also have to file an ethics disclosure with the Illinois Supreme Court. And these are Rule 315 disclosures. Now, to get these, you can't go on a website and download them, but you can request them by filling out a form with the clerk of the Supreme Court office. So in Chicago, there's one, and you can just like look up the clerk of the Supreme Court online, contact them, and they'll walk you through the process of requesting these. But every single judge has to file one of these every year. And sometimes these have a lot more information on them, simply because I think judges are not like expecting these to be as easily available to the public. But in Dej Desai's case, there wasn't a ton of information here. Again, the 2 investment accounts. Some judges, when you pull this, they'll have every single stock that they're invested in. They'll just have it listed. Usually the people that disclose to that degree, you don't find anything particularly interesting about them that were newsworthy. I think on this one, she didn't have much of anything else. We often wonder how much people are lying on these. Technically, there are like all kinds of fines and penalties for violating these, but then you'd have to like go and prove that they intentionally left something out. So we've never dug in that direction before, but we always wonder about it. And then just wanted to show you real quickly, this is an example of somebody who actually filed a disclosure form with Cook County. This guy was employed in the Bureau of, he was like a lawyer under President Preckwinkle, and he filed this ethics statement, and on his other ethics statements, it said on one of them, it said something about, I think it was his candidate one, it said like, he has like rental property. But in this one, it actually lists every single rental property he has and the address. So when I was researching this guy, I ended up like really looking through all these. It actually ended up that one of the other judge candidates was living at one of this guy's rental properties. That was just a crazy coincidence. But I ultimately I was asked when I was interviewing him, I was like, how do you like own all these rental properties? And he told me a whole story about how he got into flipping houses, and he gets these like loans that are for former military members because he was former military. So anyway, it was there wasn't much there, but it was kind of interesting to learn about this guy, and we did include information about that in the guide. All right, so that is the other things like property full disclosure, like we rely a lot on LexisNexis to do like kind of background checking related to the candidate and like who they're associated with, what property they own and stuff. That gives us a huge leg up, and Lexis is a very expensive database tool that not a lot of people have direct access to. But I mean, property records you can look up by name in the Cook County Recorder of Deeds, search tool. And we also do a lot of research on legal proceedings involving the candidates where not just the ones where they were lawyers on the cases, but like, have they ever been sued? Like what kind, have they ever been taken to court over anything? The process is substantially similar for their retention judges. The major thing that we add is the information about their appellate court reversals, which we also get from LexisNexis or from Westlaw. That kind of stuff, unfortunately, like it should really be like pretty easily accessible to the public. Like you should be able to ask that about a judge, but It's not a data point that you could request from the chief judge about anybody. Like, oh, can you tell me like how many cases are they processing every year, and how much are they getting reversed by the appellate court? Like making the wrong. How often does the appellate court said they made the wrong call? There's just like no warehouses of this kind of information. So we have to kind of piece it together on our own, and we also rely pretty heavily on interviews with people who know these folks, who've been their clients, who've been in front of them as judges, to kind of get into sharper focus on who these folks are. And last thing I'll mention actually before I get to the next slide is, if you guys don't already know about Anthony Mosier's incredible tool for looking up Secretary of State business data, you should definitely check out theseguys.com, because like in this case, it's timed out, but you can see it. So this particular, I looked up the Chicago police officer husband. I put him through here, Rishi Desai, here he is. Turns out that he and his wife, Dej Desai, who this is their address, they have this company, 3D Law LLC. Not really sure what their law business does, but it didn't come up in any way that was helpful for us. But sometimes you can get like quite a map of different business connections for these judges or their family members. All right, and the last couple of things I'll mention. So I already sort of talked about what we do to investigate judges. When it comes to trying to investigate the different programs and offices and court bureaucracy, unfortunately, a lot of this like data about like the probation department or court supervision programs or whatever, we kind of have to rely on the good graces of the Office of the Chief Judge to disclose that information. So I call it I say this kindly brontosaurus thing in here, because like we just basically have to like ask nicely and be persistent and kind of hope that they work with you. And sometimes they just they tell you to shove off basically, or they just don't respond. For me, most recently, the thing that I was kind of pumping them for was information on people assigned to the Scram alcohol monitor. I was tracking that for a couple of years pretty closely, and they happened to be pretty good about getting, like I could ask them like to give me a de-identified list of everybody who's on a Scram device and which judge put them on it and how long they've been on it and when they're supposed to get off. And they would make the third-party vendor that provides the devices share that information. And yeah, I was able to get that. But a lot of times you can't get the information. Try getting anything about the juvenile detention center, very difficult without some kind of inside source. So that's why leaks are an important part of the process often. And also FOIAing adjacent agencies. So like if other county offices are involved in administrating some court program, or the prosecutor's office or whatever, you can get records in that way. The last type of data that you might want about the courts is about the cases themselves, and that stuff is technically already public, because public like court cases, unless they're involving kids, are like public information. You can access them for free, and you can find out anything about any type of case that doesn't involve kids freely at any court terminal or even online. However, if you want bulk data, that is a type of request that has to, again, be put to the chief judge. The chief judge has to approve it, send it to the clerk of the circuit court to fulfill. Whenever they get around to all of this is when they get around to all of it, and eventually you might get your bulk data. I have a lot of practice doing this with eviction court data, and it's a very lengthy, often extremely frustrating process to get them to cough this data up, even though technically it's public information. All right, so one last thing I'll just mention is that there is an ongoing kind of organizing push to try to get the judicial branch of government to be subject to FOIA in Illinois. And currently, there's a bill in Springfield sponsored by Curtis Tarver. It's HB 4292, which amends Illinois' FOIA law to make judicial bodies a public body subject to FOIA. And it does, it carves out the kind of thing that like would be like, records related to judges' deliberations or whatever, but it would, if this were ever enacted, it would hopefully make like the probation program subject to FOIA. And however, the bill has a lot of opposition from the Administrative Office of Illinois Courts, which is like the Supreme Court bureaucracy. It has a lot of opposition from chief judges' offices and from the clerks of the circuit court, which are a very powerful machine in the state of Illinois. So if you're interested in this, you can find out more about it from online through the Court Transparency Coalition. You can Google that, and you can call your state reps and ask them to support subject matter hearings on this bill. Currently, it went through one legislative cycle already and didn't get past the Rules Committee. Now it's stuck in there again, and it hasn't even gathered that many co-sponsors this legislative session. So it feels like a pipe dream, but in the meantime, check your judges. Next election is November 5th. That's when we'll be having those dozens and dozens of candidates that we're voting yes or no on. And please subscribe to Injustice Watch's newsletter and support our work if you want by donating, because we're a nonprofit as well. And with that, I'm sorry I've run drastically over time, I think, but I'd really love to answer any questions.
No worries. This was so helpful. Thank you so much, Maya. This was great. Just a couple to kind of get started. And again, if you are watching and you have a question, please feel free to put it in the YouTube chat and we will try to get to as many as we can. I guess like one question that I kind of had starting off was like, what does accountability kind of look like in a case where, like with the one with Judge Vasquez, where he retired the day after you contacted him? Like, what would accountability kind of look like?
So unfortunately, the only accountability, the accountability process for judges' decisions about cases is appeals. And if you think a judge made the wrong decision in your case, you have a right to appeal. That right is exceedingly difficult to exercise outside of the criminal courts, because most other types of courts, all the civil side of the court, basically, there is no court reporters and no recording equipment in the courtrooms. And in order to appeal, you need a record of what was said and what happened in court. Without a transcript, it's nearly impossible to appeal. You can get something called a bystander affidavit. Basically, if you're appealing an eviction, like it's nearly impossible because there's no, I mean, now there's actually recording equipment in eviction court. But for many, many years, it was basically impossible because nothing was recorded. So decisions of the judges, the only way that the accountability mechanism is the appellate system. However, ethical things like with Judge Vasquez, that would fall under the umbrella auspices of the Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board, which is another corner of the Illinois Supreme Court bureaucracy. But the Judicial Inquiry Board is basically like you can file complaints there about, like, I don't know, let's say you get like sexually assaulted by a judge, like you can file a complaint with the Judicial Inquiry Board about that. They have a process to decide which complaint they're going to investigate. And there's like 7 people that are working as investigators for the entire state of Illinois to investigate complaints. And eventually, if they decide that the investigation has turned up enough evidence that, like, yeah, there's something here, it would go before hearings with the actual board of the Judicial Inquiry Board, and they could potentially like take the judge off the bench, take all different suspensions and disciplinary actions. But the moment that a judge retires, they are no longer subject to the jurisdiction of the Judicial Inquiry Board. So it's unfortunately a huge oversight gap in Illinois. Not all states function this way. So once they retire, that's basically it. I mean, somebody could go after their license as a lawyer, like, you could You could file complaints with the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission, and try to get them disbarred. But that's also like a very cumbersome process, and there's very few people working at that agency actually enforcing these rules.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Okay, some audience questions. What, if any, legislation is being proposed to make the associate selection process more democratic?
I'm not aware of any legislation being proposed for that. I guess I feel like there would be a hard time, it would be a hard process to get that off the ground, since we already have an actual democratic process to elect judges, and associate judges are sort of the only thing that that we have in Illinois that is some kind of more merit-based system. Traditionally, it's also been a way for women and people of color to become judges, people who have quote unquote bad ballot names. So like names that it's hard to get elected because voters like can't be bothered to like for 5 seconds actually read the person's name. That's a phenomenon, and so people have had more success becoming associate judges, if they've got that issue. But yeah, it is politicized and political as well, but it's we already have a democratic process, and I guess that's why there's not a whole push to democratize the associate judge process.
Okay, I think we can squeeze in one more real quick. Okay. Is there any proposed legislation around expanding FOIA?
Yeah, this is that's the bill, HB 4292. It is currently stuck in the Rules Committee in Springfield. Call your state rep and ask them to have subject matter hearings on this bill, if this is something that is interesting to you. But this is Rules Committee is where bills go to die. So there's a lot of lobbying. There's going to be a lot of lobbying against this bill, because the clerks of the circuit court statewide are very powerful organizations, because there's a lot of people working for them. So, but this is out there. There's a lot of people who care about this, who want to amend FOIA to open it up into the court system.
Some okay, I think.
And I'm happy to stick around to be part of your
Breakout
breakout groups or whatever. So I can float around, or you can stick me in one of them. And if people want to chat more and ask more questions, I'm happy to.
That would be wonderful, because I see that we already have like another question about eviction court, and I know we don't have time here, so we have to break to that.
Put me in a group with that person.
Perfect. Okay. Josh, if you don't mind showing the link to get into our next portion of the evening. Okay, so if you want to chat more with Maya and ask all your burning questions, please join us at this link here, bit.ly/chn-remote-zoom. Join us there, learn about all the other breakout groups that are happening, and we'll see you shortly.